Okay, guys, today, very special guest, Hester Peirce from the SEC, one of the more serious people that I get to talk to. So this is quite exciting. Hopefully I can have some of our collective questions answered. So Hester, welcome. I know you need to give a disclaimer that not all views are yours or whatever. So I'll go ahead and let you do that and we can jump in.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And it is true that the views that I represent are my own views as commissioner, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners.
Awesome. Okay. So again, I don't think you need much of an introduction. I think almost everybody in our industry knows who you are. Where are we right now? There's like maybe just broad strokes in terms of bills, legislation, current regulation. We had Fit 21 a year ago now, and we're now working on the Clarity Act. Can you just give us like a brief overview for some context,
Sure.
and then I'll start probing?
Yeah, so we did Fit 21 was kind of the first market structure iteration, and the how in the House, and the House then passed the Clarity Act this Congress, and the Clarity Act is this broad market structure act, and now the Senate is working on their version of the Clarity Act, and then if they can come to a point where if the Senate passes something and then they can come to a point where they agree on something, then we'll get a market structure bill. Much the same way that happened with the stablecoin bills. You had, parallel tracks going on in the House and the Senate, and they ultimately agreed on something. But while that's going on, we at the SEC and other regulators are also working on stuff. We have existing authority that we can use to write rules already. And so we're doing that. The president obviously has been very involved in trying to move crypto clarity forward. And so has, he commissioned a report, President's Working Group, which is a bunch of agencies, federal agencies. We came together and we wrote a report on, the big plan of how to move forward on crypto. So that's kind of where we are. And we'll see whether the market structure bill moves forward. But there is a lot of momentum now in Congress to get something done.
Okay, awesome. And I have a whole bunch of questions for you. And I don't know how well I've designed these in order. So if I just start throwing stuff at you, understand that I just have a ton of different things I want to talk about. So the Clarity Act, there for the first time, we have sort of this carve out of securities, commodities, and then now there's discussion of, and I don't know how much this applies to the securities aspect, but this ancillary assets. Can you explain, just go back a little bit now and explain how kind of commodities and securities were delineated in the context of crypto?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is still very much a developing topic. And I'm not going to purport to be an expert on how the Senate and the House are thinking about these things. I mean, obviously have seen what they're both trying to do, but I think the idea is because there's been so much over the years, there's been so much concern about not being able to identify that line between when is a token a security, when is it something else. Now, it's sometimes very obvious. And I think one of the interesting things that's happened since Washington has done its 180 toward crypto is that now a lot of people are trying to come in and tokenize just traditional securities. And so obviously, those are easy. If it's a traditional security and you tokenize it, it's still a security. Now, it might be a different kind of security with different kind of rules around it. So that is something that people need to be careful about because there are a lot of different approaches being thought about for tokenization. But so sort of putting those aside, the questions have really been around the tokens that are sold with a lot of promises that people are going to build out a network or they're going to do something to make sure that everyone is using this token. And so it's like you're buying not only the token, but you're buying promises. And that's what led the SEC to take the position that these were all securities transactions. And it was a very tortured attempt to use enforcement to force these things in. And so then the question that really arose because we have something called the Howey test from the Supreme Court, which interprets one part of the definition of security, investment contracts. An investment contract is when you give money to someone else with the expectation that that other person is going to take efforts to make your investment grow, right? And you don't have to do anything. So it's investment of money with the expectation of profits based solely on the efforts of other people. And so that was the framework that was used to pull a lot of crypto transactions into the securities laws. The ancillary asset concept came up from saying, wait a minute, when you're looking at an investment contract, the security is not actually the thing at the center of the investment contract. Howey was about orange groves, as lots of people in the crypto world now know. The orange groves were not themselves the security. They're kind of the ancillary asset. And so, how can you sort of think about when does the contract separate from the ancillary asset? Or is the contract always part of that? That's where the debate kind of it lies. And that's where a lot of the legislation and the regulation is trying to figure out how can we make a line that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'll come back to that in a bit. We long time now in crypto have heard this. Yeah, it's sort of like an oft-repeated phrase, which is that come in and register, and there was no ability to register, right? Like this is something that you hear ad infinitum, and ostensibly the goal of these market structure and just regulation or the legislation in general is to fix that. What exactly prevented people from registering? Like when I heard a founder, right, say, Gary wants us to come in and register, we can't register. What was it specifically that didn't allow them to do that? And maybe as a result, I'll start probing about what we're doing now.
Yeah. So, I mean, some people did try to do that, but I think when I looked at it and I saw that the issue was that, so when you offer a security, you have to do it in either a registered offering where you have to provide all kinds of disclosures, or you do it under an exemption. And the exemption might be conditioned on things like you can only sell it to rich people or to institutions, right? And so the problem is if you're trying to release a token out into the wild, you really don't want to limit your audience just to rich people and institutions. You want everyone to be able to buy it. And so that was what the registration provisions didn't really contemplate, right? Because they contemplate when you do a public offering that, we think of IPOs, right? When a company decides it wants to go public, it wants everyone to be able to buy its shares. It tends to be a pretty big company that's been around for a long time, that has audited financials, that has a track record and has a pretty big compliance and regulatory legal staff. And so what we were saying is, hey, little projects that are trying to do token offerings, if you want to do a token offering here, you can essentially do an IPO or use Regulation A, which is kind of a little bit of a streamlined IPO process. But those really didn't match the state of the project, and they really wouldn't have gotten at the essence of what that project was, so that investors wouldn't really get the information they needed about the project to consider whether they wanted to buy that token. And so there was kind of just this mismatch. And that's what we're trying to fix.
That makes sense. Okay. This is now we're kind of getting into stuff that I think maybe questions you don't always get, and hopefully will be interesting for my audience. I come at this maybe from thinking of it, a lot of these crypto projects as protocols, like first and foremost, open source software. And I have a lot of kind of thoughts about ownership in protocols and what that actually means. I'm curious, how does the SEC in its current state, if you had to, sort of articulate what it means to own a protocol, or is it even possible to own a protocol? And because I'll give you a little bit of context. You have no idea who I am. I have argued with people about this before, and I kind of put forth this idea that a protocol is like this set of rules, right? And people opt into it or they don't, but no one owns it, right? And I look at, coming from Bitcoin, I think this is fairly straightforward. Like nobody owns the Bitcoin network. Owning Bitcoin doesn't give you ownership over the Bitcoin network. This gets a little bit more dicey when we start talking about DeFi protocols and fee switches that can be turned on. And it's not always clear to me what it means to own a protocol. So I guess I'll let you, take this however you want, but what is the current view? Can you own a protocol? And what would that look like in terms of securitization or, what a token would resemble in that context?
Well, I mean, again, I have to reiterate that you're just getting my views, right? But I mean, that is what a protocol is, right? It's a set of rules, and and I think this is one of the beauties of what DeFi is, right? That you have a set of rules, they're open source, so everyone knows what they are and everyone can participate on the same terms. And so that is something that nobody owns, right? That's the whole thing, is that it's out there and anyone can use it. I think government sometimes misunderstands and they think someone does own it and can turn it off, but you actually can't turn it off. It's always there. But then the question is there something there, right? Is there a treasury?
Right.
And that might be real money. And someone owns that. Someone has the right to take that. And there might be a decentralized ownership of it, or it might be purported to be decentralized, and there might actually be 3 guys in their basement who can take it all. And so these are the kinds of things I think people should want to know. But I don't know when you're buying a token that you're buying the protocol. You might be buying rights to the treasury, or you might be buying rights to, I mean, I think that's part of the problem, right? You have to understand what it is you're actually getting with that token. And sometimes it might be not much.
Right.
But I think that's what makes this a little bit tricky. You're not buying a piece of a company.
Right.
You're buying maybe the right to profit from the treasury, to have a piece of the treasury, or maybe just to profit as the network itself gains usage, and your token, which is the coin of that realm, right? The thing that people need to use that protocol. If that becomes more valuable because more people want to use it, then you just made more money. So that you're buying a piece of the usability of the network effects.
Yeah. In the context, I'm always curious about this, because this is another thing that we in crypto think makes logical sense. And I tend to think it makes logical sense for what it's worth, which is that if some contract, for example, is completely ossified, right? There's no upgradability. In the minds of a lot of us in crypto. Now, I will qualify this by saying there's a lot more contracts that are upgradable than non-upgradable. But let's put that aside for a second and assume we're talking about a smart contract pushed to a sufficiently decentralized L1, for example, that cannot be changed, right? In our eyes, we look at this and we say, like, this is the vision, right? Like, this is what we're talking about. This decentralized group of nodes ultimately executes that, and it really has no say on or discretion, right? It's binary.
Yeah.
And we think of this as like, this is the vision. But does the government care? Like, do you guys, I say you guys, sorry, I don't mean to, like throw it on you, but like, do things like this matter a lot when you're looking at projects? Like the upgradability, are there multi-sigs? Is it ossified? Like, does that make a difference when it comes to legislation in your mind?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of things going on here, right? One is, I think that I also think that prospect is really interesting for changing the way that we as people interact with one another, because there is some real value to having, just knowing what the terms are and knowing that everyone else is coming in on the same terms and that can't change. And I think that's really powerful in a lot of different contexts, but that's really not the question that is before me as a securities regulator, except for the fact that I want to make sure that we don't attempt to jam our securities laws on top of one of those decentralized protocols to say, hey, you've got to register as an exchange or as a broker dealer or whatever. I mean, if it's really code just doing its thing out there, it can't register with us. So I don't know what that means, and I don't want that to have to happen. So I think we do need to put a protection around this to say code is code. Developers who write code don't have to register as something for just writing or publishing code. But I think then the question becomes, when you are just a centralized entity that is using code to do something that is regulated by us already, well, yeah, I mean, then we're in a different world. And then we have to figure out what does it look like for you to register as an intermediary in the securities space? And are there rules that need to change because you're now relying on code to do something that before you might have relied on other things to do, people or, other kinds of rules. And in that instance, maybe there are adjustments we need to make. Maybe some of the requirements that we have don't really make any sense anymore because you can code some stuff in that then doesn't have to be, like as an example, if you want to transfer assets to someone else, you might have to go through an intermediary or you could go through code. And the code has this nice ability to lock up. It gets the assets from one person, it gets the money from the other, it locks them both up until they're both there, and then it makes an atomic swap of those. And so you don't have the problems that you might otherwise have. Okay, so then the regulations need to take that into account.
Yeah.
And so that might require us to adjust, but you still have something that, as long as we have regulations, they're going to someone in that transaction. Does that make sense? I mean, I think trying to distinguish between what's truly decentralized stuff happening and what's just a centralized entity using a decentralized protocol to do something.
So I initially asked you, right, this idea of come in and register, and all these teams saying we can't. And it seems very reasonable that they couldn't, right, for numerous reasons. And the most obvious being that this is like a completely different type of technology. But one thing I do wonder about is when you explain, like, maybe perhaps why they couldn't register, there was a lot of kind of sounded like back office overhead and costs associated with that. That would mean that you're asking, maybe a seed stage or Series A company to come and implement the exact same, rigorous sort of reporting requirements as NVIDIA or Tesla. I'm making extreme examples here.
That's a good.
That to me, that sounds sort of like the essence of it. And so my question is there anything? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, it is certainly part of it, right? If you've got 3 developers working together building something, they're not going to have audited financial statements. I mean, it would be silly, and no one would want them to have that. I do think that there is the difference here, I think, is that people are trying to build network effects. And so you really have to do a public offering in a way that before, I mean, if it were not for the need for network effects, you would probably just limit yourself to the VCs who probably initially funded you anyway. But at some point, you need those tokens to be in the hands of lots of people.
Yes. Okay. That makes sense. I guess what I'm asking, I'm trying not to ask this with like too cynical of a lens, but is there anything in your mind that is uniquely enabled by crypto when launching a token that would mean it's not a security? And I'm saying this in the context of like one of these projects that we're talking about that may generate revenue and buyback or burn or issue dividends. Is there anything that you have this team and they put out some open source code, but then there's a treasury and they receive money from resembles very much a common enterprise, right? I think a lot of people will concede this. Is there anything in your mind that is unique to crypto that outside of this kind of like burdensome reporting requirements, you would also say, okay, well, this is another reason it might not be a security? And this is outside of the kind of commodity discussion we had prior.
Well, but I think it's not necessarily a security because you're not getting a share of that enterprise, right? You're not, and it may be a securities transaction when you sell the VCs those tokens, right? They're buying the tokens with maybe even before the network is built, and there's this promise that you're going to build the network. You give me money, I promise that you can just sit back and I'll build the network, and then you'll be able later to sell the tokens and you'll make money. That very well might be a securities offering, right? I think that could very well, and most people think that transaction is covered by the securities laws. But I think it really is important for people to know, if they're buying a token, that they're not necessarily getting a piece of the venture that the three people have built through which they're building that, I just want to make sure people know what they're actually getting.
Okay.
Right. So those 3 people might go on to build something else, and the token holders aren't going to get a share of that other thing because they just have tokens.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And we've seen examples of this. So I understand why you'd
But I mean, I think it's good to be cynical. And I think that is one of the things that unfortunately has emerged from the fact that we've taken such a weird regulatory approach to this whole space that it has really encouraged people to do a lot of things that probably were not particularly convenient for them. Yeah. They're trying to avoid the securities laws. They're not good for the people who actually bought the thing. And maybe at the end of the day, if we came up with some better rules that worked for small projects trying to do these kinds of things, where you actually had to make some disclosures and you had to do some things, people wouldn't be as scared of having something be a security. Because they would know it would work. And then they would think, okay, maybe this is a time where a security makes sense. Maybe here's a place where it doesn't. Maybe we don't need a token here after all. Maybe we just are trying to build a company and we just want people to invest in your company. So I'd like people to be able to have those kind of conversations in a world where they know that if they think they need to have some touch with the securities laws, they can come in and say, here's what we're trying to build. We think there's a securities angle here. Can you help us figure out how we can do this while still being commercially viable?
The Gwart Show is sponsored by Ellipsis Labs, who I've been following for 3 years now. They're one of the strongest teams I know in crypto. Ellipsis Labs is a small engineering team with a flat structure. They build complex systems, primarily in Rust. For engineers who like challenges, here's the kind of problem they solve. A layer 2 blockchain needs to maintain 100 million accounts and generate a state root after each transaction batch. The root must be built within 50 milliseconds. How would you design a system to ensure the root construction is fast enough? High-performance challenges are core to Ellipsis Labs' mission as they build modern crypto finance. They believe finance needs more than an upgrade. It needs a complete rewrite. The success of their first product, Phoenix V1, speaks for itself, doing over $70 billion in organic trading volume. Now, Ellipsis Labs is building Atlas, the blockchain purpose-built for verifiable finance. I know this team personally, and I like them because they're unique in the crypto space. They have a long-term focus, they work in person from their New York City headquarters, and they're here to build products that fundamentally change the world of finance. If you want to learn more about their open rules, go to ellipsislabs.xyz/careers. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. A lot of the rules have been predicated on this idea of custody and what that means. Are we changing at all our understanding of custody with these new bills and regulations coming up? Is there any modification to how we understand custody? And maybe actually you can just explain what our understanding of custody has been thus far and why it's been such an important sort of Schelling point, and then going forward.
Well, I mean, I think why we think a lot about custody at the SEC is because when you regulate centralized intermediaries that are handling other people's money or property like securities, there are a lot of things you worry about. You worry about that person, that centralized intermediary, being dishonest and stealing it. You worry about them being careless and losing it. And so that's why we built rules around custody for broker-dealers, for investment advisors. But custody can be very difficult it can be difficult to know whether someone actually has custody. And we see this come up all the time in the investment advisor context, not in the context of crypto, but just in the context of other types of assets and funds. When are you deemed to have custody of someone's assets? When you have the ability to direct a transaction in that person's account, when you have the ability to withdraw fees from that person's account. I mean, obviously, if you have the actual thing that you're custodying,
it's pretty straightforward.
But there are a lot of questions that arise, and the SEC put out a modernization of its investment advisor rules on custody, a proposal several years ago, and it got a lot of blowback. It got blowback from crypto because part of what it did is kind of incorporate thinking around crypto custody, but it got a lot of blowback from traditional firms that didn't have anything to do with crypto. And they thought we had gotten a lot of the answers wrong on just traditional custody. And so I guess my point of telling you that is that it's very complicated because it's not always clear if you have custody. And I think crypto adds the new layer. People can self-custody. It's much easier now for people to self-custody. And so that brings us back to the days where people could have their own stock certificates. So you can really do that. You can have that in your own wallet. You don't need an intermediary. And I think that's a very powerful concept. But there are also questions about, well, if you're working with a client and you're helping that client with the client's crypto assets, there may be things that you need to do. Stake the assets. You may need to trade them. And so that means that for some point, you got to have custody so you can put them on an exchange and trade them. And so there are questions there. And then there's a different approach has emerged. We have much more vertical integration in crypto trading platforms. And so they're having custody of their clients' assets. We saw what happened with an exchange like FTX. So there are a lot of different issues that arise around custody, but I think that's why we spend so much time thinking about it, because it's a real point where people can get hurt.
What is your thinking around bridges and multisigs? How do these fit into custody models? Like, this is obviously something that's fascinating for crypto. It's also been sort of a gray area for us, in the sense that there's maybe some ways for us to enforce or exit a system, but in terms of custody, you can make an argument that if somebody can upgrade a bridge or has some unilateral spending power or whatever on something like a multisig, that can change like sort of the dynamics. I'm curious, what is the kind of current thinking around these types of bridges and multisigs?
Well, I mean, I think we have to think about where is the connection with securities law. And I think that, yeah, potentially it can come up in the sense that if you have a multisig, but it depends who has the keys, right? How spread out is that? And so it can be that we have to answer those questions about whether someone has custody because that person has the ability to shift all the funds to herself, right? Or steal them, or, whatever. And then with bridges too, I mean, I think there are a lot of vulnerabilities there when you're bridging. And I think that is an area we're going to have to think about. I don't know that I'm thinking about those things on a day-to-day basis. Maybe I should be. But I think investment advisors maybe are engaging with these things, or as you're putting more securities on blockchains, I think we're going to have to think about these things more, because you are going to end up bridging from one chain to the next. And I think that will be an area where there are potentially some problems.
Okay, a little bit of a pivot. I don't want to put words in your mouth, so you can obviously explain the rationale behind this, but you made a comment to the sort of saying that meme coins are meme coins. They are closer to being collectibles, and you play in meme coins. We don't regulate that. Is that sort of the current thinking of the SEC, and how, or your personal opinion, sorry, and how do you think about that going forward in terms of like what defines a meme coin and who can launch them? And yeah, I'm just kind of curious. Obviously, there's been a big influx of meme coins as of late, and I did see you make a comment there, so I'm kind of interested in hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, and I made that comment in connection with a staff statement on meme coins. Not typically, again, facts and circumstances matter to any lawyer, so they matter, but the typical meme coin is not a typical sale of a meme coin is not a securities offering. All you're doing is you're selling this token, and there's nothing about it that makes it a security. And so I think part of the reason that I wanted to put out that statement, and wanted the staff to put out the statement, is that people should know you're not getting a bunch of securities law protections. So there could be a lot of stuff going on. You don't know who's behind that meme token, who's going to be dumping it when, they manage to, the price goes up and then someone's out there dumping it. You would, in the context of securities laws, if these were securities, have some protections that you don't have if they're meme coins. So why is it like a digital collectible instead of a security? I mean, I just don't see any element of something that is a token that's offered without any link to any promises of profitability, of someone doing work to make your meme coin worth more. I don't see how that how that could be a security. And so that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. Now, again, there could be circumstances in which you create something that is a meme coin, but you've promised to do something in connection with it that could potentially turn that into the meme coin could be at the center of an investment contract, but that's not how they're typically offered.
But yeah, and I understand this is like typically on a case by case basis, but it is kind of interesting if you were to launch a meme coin and then get on Twitter every day and usher the crowds to pump it to $1 is like this is still outside of the context of securities laws, would you say? I mean, because I think
because I think you see the same kind of thing with all kinds of things that people sell, right? And would you really want to turn all those things into securities? Probably not. I don't think that we have the capacity even to regulate all those kinds of things. But there's a lot of bad behavior that happens outside of the realm that we can regulate. And that was part of my message too, is like people need to be careful and not assume that they're going to be millionaires because they bought the latest meme coin.
Okay.
I mean, and I also approach I think it is important for us to put some limits around what the SEC does and to tell people that because Congress gave us authority over a very limited part of the market. And we have to play within that space that they gave us. People are constantly coming to the SEC and they're saying, why aren't you stopping XYZ really bad thing from happening? Which is either happening outside of the US, which we do not have authority to regulate, or it's happening in an area that we, again, don't have authority to regulate. And so we need to provide clarity about where we are and where we aren't and where we can help and where we can't.
Hey, Will here with Blockspace Media. Did you know that we have individual feeds for all our shows? If you're watching the Mining Pod, Bitcoin Season 2, or the Gwart Show, be sure to check out the individual feeds. You can find them on your podcast player of choice, whether that be Spotify, Apple, YouTube, etc. Just type in Blockspace Media and you'll find all our shows pop up, or just type in the individual show name like the Mining Pod or Bitcoin Season 2. Be sure to hit that subscribe and give us a 5-star rating so we can continue to bring you the best content in Bitcoin.
A lot of us in crypto, we come from this like don't trust, verify or whatever. I'm throwing out one of these many tropes, right? And in many ways, we've been skeptical of the state and just outsized power in any type of networks or society at large. And this has been one of the mindsets. And like again, this kind of don't trust, verify. Like we want it to be able to see for ourselves. And now there's all this lobbying going on, and I don't personally have any idea if these people have the best faith for the industry or for their personal bags. And so when I see, all of these discussions about how things should be labeled, and I have no idea if that's good for the retail investor, right? It may be very good for the VC. It may be very good for the institution, but it's very hard for us to look at this stuff and say, oh yes, like this is a clear, upgrade from, what we had in the past, where there's a Cayman Foundation and there's somebody in New York and then there's lawyers out, like, you know what I mean? We have no idea. We have no idea how to parse this stuff. And I'm curious, like when these people come in and talk to you, like what is your kind of relationship with them, and like who do you hear from? That's one question. Like who do you end up hearing from?
Well, I try to hear from as many people as I can. And I think one thing that we've tried to do as the task force is to be pretty transparent about who we're meeting with and about, we have a file where we're getting written input that's all public. People can see it. They can write us and tell us that whatever someone else said was completely wrong. And I think that is important to have that kind of back and forth. I mean, I've been now in Washington for a long time, and I've been at the SEC as a regulator for a long time, but I've been here in the commissioner role for a long time, but I was here before on the staff. And so I've seen a lot of lobbying. I also worked on Capitol Hill, right? So I've seen a lot of lobbying, and indeed people do speak their bags, right? It's not only in crypto, it's in every area. And so you do have to sort of filter what everyone says, understanding that, people are coming and they're speaking. And, there's nothing wrong with that, right? They can come and talk to us about what's important to them. And that is often because it will yield economic benefits to them if they get the result that they want. And so I think you have to sort of filter that. But if you talk to a lot of people, you kind of get a sense of where maybe there's some commonality and you think maybe that is helpful in understanding what could be a good solution. Long time ago, I put together a safe harbor proposal, which would have tried to at least get some disclosure out there for people buying tokens in ICOs and other token distribution events. And I had talked to a lot of people about what kind of information is actually valuable to people. But I do try to go out too, and because there is one group of people who can either afford to come to Washington or they have people in Washington. And so part of what I do like to do is go out and talk to people in other places. And sometimes that means I might even talk to the same companies, but I'll talk to a different person from that company, the person that they don't send to Washington.
Yeah.
And you can get a different view of things from the person who doesn't get sent to Washington. And then I listen to a ton of podcasts too. And that's not the answer to everything, but it does help me sometimes to think through an issue or to understand an issue better. I have a lot of issues other than crypto that I'm working on. So it's not as if my whole diet is crypto, but I do try to learn as much as I can. And I have to have some skepticism. I know I'm never going to understand the technology as well as I need to or should for this job. And so I try to do the best that I can do, but I worry a lot about how can we make sure that we're not creating a system that benefits the ones who can lobby best or the ones who are the incumbents. And it is kind of funny. I mean, just having you see these people who come in, and obviously the traditional financial firms are a little bit concerned because they weren't doing a lot during the time when the government was very anti-crypto. Now that the government is much more positively inclined, they're like, oh, we need to catch up. We want to be involved in this tokenization. And so, hey, they want to slow down the native crypto firms because they want to be able to catch up. And so they want us to use our rules to slow them down. But at the same time, you've got native crypto firms who are wanting us not to make any changes so that the traditional financial firms can't get in the game. And so everyone's kind of playing games that are very familiar from a lobbying perspective. And I don't want this to come across as if I'm bitter, because I'm very grateful for anyone who's willing to come talk to me. But I think there are always going to be a lot of those tactics being used. And also having a lot of people, I have great people at the SEC on the task force and throughout the staff of the commission. And they're people who know so much more than I do. And they can also help me filter what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think that lobbying kind of gets this poor reputation, but the reality, it's a very legitimate business and endeavor in the sense that there are regulators like yourself, there are legislators who don't have the full scope. I mean, you can take this outside of the context of crypto. They don't understand stuff and they need to make, what are pragmatic decisions. I'm not, so I have nothing necessarily against lobbying. I don't even have anything against crypto lobbying. I guess that this industry is a little bit unique in the sense that it was persecuted for so long. I say persecuted. I mean, you can decide whether or not that's the truth, but a lot of people within the industry, as you know, felt like we were persecuted for so long that there was almost this pendulum effect whereby once we were accepted, there was a rush to sort of support anybody and everybody lobbying and pushing this industry forward. And in some sense, there was a rush, like a literal rush, like we need to take advantage of this. We need to reach escape velocity before we get in trouble again. And I think that what a lot of us, again, who kind of sit more on the sidelines, I just have no idea, right? Like I have no idea if A16Z and Paradigm, and I'm friends with some of these people, right? I have no idea if they're pushing what is really best for retail or is a new sort of VC playbook. And so that was the only reason I asked. I wasn't trying to get you to, be too cynical or anything like that. But that's kind of where we come from,
Yeah, it's perfectly fair to ask. And I think we need to be, there are just a lot of voices out there and everyone is speaking, they have whatever incentives, and we do have to take that into account as we listen to people. And at the end of the day, what my objective is, the objective that Congress gave us, which is protect investors, facilitate capital formation, foster fair, orderly, and efficient markets. And the protecting investors part is obviously very important, but part of protecting investors is also making sure that they have access to a lot of opportunities. And at the end of the day, because of my regulatory philosophy, which is very much one of people are adults, they can make their own decisions. Government is there for a reason. We have a regulatory role to play, but it is only the role that Congress gave us. It is no more than that. And when I have the opportunity to make a choice for a super prescriptive approach or a more permissive approach, I'm going to opt for the more permissive approach, because I think, again, we live in a country that prides itself on valuing the right of individual citizens to make their own decisions. And so I also think that those more permissive approaches tend to be ones that are better at preventing the kinds of things you're worried about, which is
yes,
a very complex regulatory framework that works really nicely for one entity or one group of entities and is terrible for everyone else. And it's terrible for anyone who wants to come in and try to challenge them and compete with them. And so I think taking a more principles-based approach does help to solve some of those problems. But I will tell you, I mean, this is something that I worry about every day. And I often think I would be very happy if someone else could come into this job and do my job, because having a fresh set of eyes, a fresh mind to think about these things would not be a bad thing. So I worry about exactly what you're worrying about.
I don't envy your job. Honestly, if I was in your spot, I would just be like, not my circus, not my monkeys. And I mean, that is,
I don't know. And I think
you can't do that.
No, but I think that's also, like, I think the point is too, that we have a government that's supposed to be a representative government of the people. And so I think it would be good if people like you would decide to work in government for a little bit. And one other thing that's, nice is that we do have a lot of people at the SEC who can think about things. So it's not like one person is just thinking about it.
Yeah.
You've got a lot of, the chairman has a lot of experience. And so it's wonderful working with him.
Yeah. We've seen this kind of recent push. I saw you wrote a short paper on this, of like the tokenization of current securities. So basically taking NVIDIA or Apple or Amazon and just sticking it on the blockchain. Those are clearly securities because they're securities outside of the blockchain. But what is the approach currently to this? Because a lot of us have, we're talking about 24/7 markets and, opening up access to the rest of the world. And well, they already exist outside of the blockchain. So there's already rules. But what is the current kind of thinking about tokenizing, assets that almost have nothing to do with crypto, at least in their current form?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to make sure that people who are tokenizing are being very clear with the people they're selling those tokenized securities to about what they're getting. Are they getting an actual share of the stock of a company? Are they getting a share of a special purpose vehicle that holds shares of that company? Are they getting some sort of other kind of promise to pay you money based on how that company performs? There are a lot of different approaches being thought of how to tokenize, but I think it is really important for people to be clear about what the investor is actually getting. And so that's what we're really trying to work with people on. Come in and talk to us about how you plan to tokenize. Let's think about what that model looks like. Let's think about what the disclosures look like and how you can make that available to people. And so there are a lot of very complicated questions, and people really need to have good regulatory counsel as they're thinking through these questions. And then they also need to come talk to us.
Yeah, that makes sense. You just reminded me of something that was a little bit off topic, but I am curious because this is another thing that a lot of people in crypto have kind of been critical of. And it's this concept of a company with equity that then also issues a token, and they're completely separate. And yeah, I mean, it's very fair for retail to have reservations about this. as we move forward, is this going to I shouldn't ask you it like that. Is there a problem with this? And is the new regulatory framework that is in place or coming, will it solve some of these problems where you have these governance tokens that have effectively we kind of touched on this at the beginning, but it just reminded me of that. So I'm curious, do you think we're coming to a better spot with this?
Well, I hope so, because I hope what we're trying to get to is a world where if you're issuing a token, you're making disclosures that people can then understand what they're actually getting. And I think, a lot of experimentation happens and companies are thinking, oh, what can I use a token for? And you can imagine a company that it's a public company, it sells shares, you can buy shares in the company, but it also might be a company that issues NFTs to its customers, right, to do something with. And that might make a lot of sense, and those two worlds don't necessarily need to meet. But in other instances, it might look like the company is just issuing a token to issue a token, and then people ought to understand that they're just issuing a token because they think it's cool to issue a token and you're actually getting nothing. That might be more of a meme coin, right? So I think people just need to I think because we're getting to a place where people are going to be asking these questions, because it'll be okay for people to make disclosures, and it'll be okay for people to say this is a security and then make those disclosures, or for people to say it's not a security, you're actually getting nothing. And then the buyers can make their own decision about whether they want it or not.
Is there a scenario where a governance token is not a security? The rationale for a long time has been, well, we can't really say it, but wink, wink, these are more or less securities. But the other side of that is there was a whole lot of mechanism designer people writing about how governance tokens transcend securities laws, and you're actually governing a protocol and you never expect any type of profit or ownership. It's truly some altruistic endeavor to govern a protocol, which it's unclear why someone would want to do that. But I'm curious, is there such thing as a governance token that would not be a security?
Well, I mean, again, facts and circumstances matter. And I don't know that being a governance token in itself makes something a security. And I can imagine circumstances in which someone might want to be part of governing an organization in which she doesn't own an interest, and she is doing it for altruistic reasons. I mean, people do that all the time with nonprofits, right? They want to be involved in something and they want to have a say in it, but that doesn't mean that they actually own any part of it. I think one of the sad things about the way that securities laws have been applied, and not only securities laws, but also the way the CFTC has approached things, is that people have been unwilling to participate because they've been scared that if they participate in governance, that then they're going to face the weight of a lawsuit. And so I think if we have more clarity about what these things are and about when a protocol has to register as something, and then people can make better decisions about whether they want to participate in governance. But I think the regulatory overhang has really resulted in some really strange practices around governance tokens, delegating them all to someone else. And then you wonder, are the people who really have an interest the ones who are participating in this? So I guess that's a very lawyer answer, but the facts and circumstances do matter. And I would like to see what types of things emerge when people have less fear about the legal consequences. I don't think we're going to see all these foundations and all these different labs pop up when you have the ability to just, okay, you know what, maybe we do have to register as something. That's okay. We'll figure out how to do that.
Yeah. One other side note, the concept of a bearer asset. So I think the kind of nail in the coffin was around the Patriot Act. I don't know that for a fact, but it seems like bearer assets have not been very well received by the government for a long time now. So you really cannot self-custody a share of a company. And do you see this changing with not necessarily the commodities part of crypto, but with the potential securities, ancillary assets, whatever they're going to become? Could you, self-custody in the most literal sense a token that represents ownership of a company?
I mean, you used to be able to hold it, and some people still do have them, right? A stock certificate, that's your self-custody. Yeah. So it's really the same idea. And I think but we as regulators have gotten very comfortable with a world that is overflowing with intermediaries, because it means that we get a lot of control as regulators. It's easy for us to regulate activity. It's also easy for us to do things like AML, Bank Secrecy Act control, those kinds of things. That all is dependent on a world in which everything is done through intermediaries.
Right.
But, I think as Americans, we also really value people's ability to keep things for themselves, to keep things from other people, that they don't have to tell everyone their business. And so I think this is actually a wonderful moment for us to reconsider some of the surveillance mechanisms we put in place that are reliant on intermediaries, and ask ourselves, is this really consistent with who we are as an American people? And there are a lot of very difficult questions to be answered there. There are a lot of difficult issues around, we don't want bad things done to this country. We don't want people doing bad things with any of the tools that are out there. But at the same time, giving people the ability to protect their own privacy is very important. To protect their own assets is very important. And we should never sacrifice those important things at the altar of trying to stop anyone bad from ever doing anything bad using a tool, right? And so I think self-custody is certainly something that we should take seriously. A lot of people will not want to self-custody crypto assets. It's just too complicated for a lot of people. So there will be intermediaries. But for people who want to do that, I think it's something that we should really take great pains to protect.
That makes sense. Okay, the last thing I wanted to ask you about, and this will be maybe especially interesting for some of the people who listen to this, how much do you follow MEV? Or are you familiar?
I am familiar with it. And yeah, I mean, I know that this is an issue that is very controversial in the community. And I think we asked some questions about it in the list of questions that I put out in February. And there probably is a point at which we have to think about that as securities regulators. I don't want us necessarily to jump in and solve the problems, the MEV, the issues around MEV that the community itself can solve. And I think there are a lot of people who are thinking about ways to address MEV. Some people think it's more problematic than others. I get it. That is, again, for people to work out. I think there are some places where we're going to have to confront that, but I'm not sure that I want to jump in until I see more what the community figures out about how to deal with it.
And they're working on it. I must say, like, a lot of my thought process 4 years ago was, well, this is just going to be, this is going to be nipped in the bud. I can promise you that. But there are solutions. One of the solutions, though, interestingly enough, is to just run transaction ordering on single sequencers. I'm wondering if you're familiar with this. And I will say that
you're just not giving anyone the ability to preference transactions.
Like, for example, right now, there's these layer 2 blockchains that effectively run matching engines for the in the context of trading, which we're kind of talking about now. They run matching engines, which is a pretty centralized role, and it kind of goes against a lot of our initial understanding of blockchains, whereby you have all these distributed nodes, and probabilistically you're going to have a transaction included, and that's the whole premise of censorship resistance. Now you have these chains that have said, okay, well, we can solve this problem of front running and back running and sandwiching by just encoding it into the rules of effectively a single server. Now, that's actually great usually for retail execution. So oftentimes when there's centralized matching engines, retail ends up getting better prices. But I am curious how much you have been forced to look into the nuance of this now, because a lot of these L2s are running what would reasonably be viewed as exchanges that have some slight differences, but they are ultimately matching orders and controlling the ordering of transactions. And I'm just curious if you've looked much into this, or if the SEC has a current view on this.
Well, I mean, if the assets that are being matched are not securities, obviously we don't have anything to say about it. And I think a lot of as the chairman recently said, most of the crypto assets out there now are not securities. I think this becomes more of an issue when you're talking about tokenizing securities and where are those things going to be, where are those transactions going to be happening. And I think this is where, the questions about when is something actually decentralized and when is something not become very tricky. And I think that ties into this question because, if you have a matching engine essentially that's controlled by one entity that controls all the pieces of that, then that looks a lot more like an exchange. And we're going to have to think about that.
Okay.
For sure.
Interesting.
And the people who are running those things are also going to have to think about that if they're transacting, if they're matching securities transactions.
Okay, great. Well, maybe in the future I can have you back on when we've have more clarity on that.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to do a lot more learning and thinking between now and then.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's been fantastic. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.